Ash was small even for a hatchling. Most dragon babies came into the world with strong wings folded tight against their backs and a low rumble already building in their throats. They cracked their shells with force. They lifted their heads on the very first day and looked around like they already owned everything they saw. Ash had not done any of that. He had come out slowly, quietly, and too small. His wings were crooked. His scales were dull instead of bright. The other hatchlings in the clutch had pushed him aside without even looking at him. The mother had looked at him once, just once, and then turned away. That was 3 days ago. Now he was alone in a cave on the side of a cold hill, and the storm outside was getting worse. The wind came howling through the cave entrance like something alive and angry. Rain hit the rocks in heavy sheets. Thunder rolled across the sky so loud that the cave floor shook with it. Ash pressed himself deeper into the corner, into the darkest part of the cave, where the cold stone pressed against his sides. It did not help. He was shivering. His small body had not yet learned how to hold warmth. Dragon hatchlings were supposed to sleep close together in the first weeks, sharing heat, keeping each other alive. Ash had no one to share heat with. He had not eaten in 2 days. His belly ached with it. He looked toward the cave entrance. Outside was only darkness and rain and wind. There was nothing coming. No one was coming. He knew that. He had known it since the first night alone, when he had waited and watched the entrance for hours, hoping that maybe the mother would come back, that maybe she had made a mistake, that maybe she would press her warm nose to his head and take him home. She had not come. No one had come. Ash closed his eyes. He was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. His legs had stopped feeling cold an hour ago. His tail lay still against the cave floor. He could hear his own breathing, small and shallow and slow. Each breath felt harder than the last. He thought about nothing. There was nothing left to think about. Then he heard something. At first he thought it was just the storm changing, the wind finding a new way through the rocks. But then he heard it again, a sound that was not wind, not rain, not thunder. It was footsteps. Heavy ones moving carefully over wet ground. Ash opened his eyes. A light appeared at the cave entrance. Not lightning. It was steady and warm and orange, the kind of light that came from fire held in a human hand. A torch. Ash pressed himself flat against the back wall. Every old instinct fired at once. Stay still, stay small, do not make a sound. He had heard the older dragons talk about humans. They were loud and they carried weapons and they were not to be trusted. If a human found him here, alone and weak, it would not end well. The figure stepped inside. It was a man, not very tall, wearing a soaked wool coat that was dark with rainwater. He had a travel pack on his back and a torch in one hand. His boots were muddy. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked exhausted and cold and miserable, not like a hunter, not like a soldier. He looked like someone who had simply been caught in a bad storm and needed somewhere dry to stand. The man, Walt was his name, though Ash did not know that yet, stepped further inside and held the torch up to look around. He was breathing hard from walking in the storm. He set his pack down against the wall and let out a long breath. Then he saw Ash. He went still. Ash went still too. For a long moment neither of them moved. Walt stared at the small dark shape huddled in the corner. Ash stared back at the human with the warm light. The torch crackled between them. Walt took one slow step back toward the entrance. Then he stopped. He tilted his head slightly and looked more carefully at Ash. Really looked, the way people do when they are trying to understand something instead of just reacting to it. Ash was trembling. Not from fear now. From cold. His sides were shaking with it and he could not make them stop. Walt's expression changed. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not shout. He set the torch carefully into a crack in the rock so that it stood upright on its own, and then he knelt down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. He stayed like that for a moment, just watching, making sure Ash could see that his hands were empty. Then he reached into his pack. He pulled out a small piece of dried meat, leaned forward, and set it on the cave floor between them. Then he leaned back and waited. Ash looked at the food. He looked at the man. He looked at the food again. His hunger won. He crept forward on shaking legs, grabbed the meat and pulled back to his corner. He ate it in 3 quick bites. It was the first thing he had eaten in 2 days and it tasted better than anything he could remember. Walt watched him eat. He did not move closer. He just sat back against the cave wall, pulled his wet coat tighter around himself, and let out another long breath. Outside the storm raged on. Inside the cave the torch burned warm and steady. Ash looked at the human one more time. Then he lowered his head onto his front legs and let his eyes close. He was still cold. He was still small and weak and alone. But for the first time in 3 days the darkness did not feel quite so heavy. Walt did not sleep that night. He had meant to. He was tired enough. His legs ached from hours of walking through the storm and his coat was still damp against his skin. The cave was not warm but it was dry and dry was enough. He had found a corner, set his torch in the rock, and told himself he would close his eyes for just a few hours. But every time he started to drift he heard it. The shivering. The small dragon in the corner had not stopped trembling since Walt first saw him. It was not the sharp, quick shiver of fear. It was the deep, slow shake of a body that had been cold for too long. Walt had seen that kind of shivering before, in lambs born too early, in wet dogs left out in winter, in his younger brother once after falling into the river in late autumn. It was the kind of shivering that did not stop on its own. Walt sat up and looked across the cave. The hatchling was curled as tight as he could make himself, nose tucked under his tail, wings pressed flat. Even curled up he looked impossibly small. His scales caught the torchlight and Walt could see now that they were not the deep rich color that dragon scales were supposed to be. They were pale and dull, like stone that had never seen the sun. Walt frowned. He reached into his pack and took out the last piece of dried bread. He had been saving it for morning. He held it out toward the hatchling and made a low, quiet sound, the same sound he used with nervous animals back on the farm. The hatchling opened one eye. Walt set the bread on the ground between them and pulled his hand back slowly. The hatchling watched him for a long moment. Then hunger won again just as it had with the meat. He crept forward, took the bread and retreated. He ate it quickly without taking his eyes off Walt. Walt nodded slowly. Then he reached behind himself and pulled out the old cloak he kept rolled at the bottom of his pack. It was not much, thick wool worn at the edges, patched in 2 places. But it was dry and it was warm. He moved toward the hatchling slowly, one careful step at a time. The hatchling pressed back against the wall. His eyes were wide. Walt stopped. He crouched down until he was low to the ground and held the cloak out in front of him with both hands open so the hatchling could see what it was. He waited. The hatchling stared at the cloak. He stared at Walt. He looked at the cave entrance as though he was thinking about running. But his legs were still shaking and outside the storm had not eased at all. Rain was hammering the hillside. Wind screamed past the entrance. Walt stayed still and waited. Slowly, very slowly, the hatchling stopped pressing against the wall. He looked at the cloak again. Then he lowered his head just slightly, which Walt decided to take as permission. He moved forward the last few steps and draped the cloak gently over the small body. The hatchling flinched at the touch but did not pull away. Walt tucked the edges in around him as best he could, the way he had done with the lamb born too small last spring. Then he sat back against the wall nearby and watched. It took a little while. But slowly, gradually, the shivering became less. The deep hard shaking turned to a lighter trembling and then after some time, it stopped almost completely. The hatchling let out a long slow breath and his eyes grew heavy. Walt leaned his head back against the stone wall and stared at the cave ceiling. He thought about what he was doing. He was a farmer. He had a small piece of land 2 days' walk from here, a vegetable patch, 3 goats, and a roof that needed fixing before the cold season set in properly. He did not know anything about dragons. He had never been closer to one than a distant shape in the sky. Everything he had ever heard said that dragons were dangerous, that they burned villages, that they took livestock and did not apologize for it. The older men in his village spoke about dragons the way they spoke about bad weather, something you could not reason with, something you simply tried to survive. And yet, he looked at the small shape under his cloak. This did not look like something that burned villages. This looked like something that had been left out in the cold and had nearly not made it through the night. He did not fully understand why he had given the food. He did not fully understand why he had given the cloak. He was not a man who thought too hard about his own reasons for things. He just did what seemed right in the moment and sorted the rest out later. This had seemed right. Across the cave, the hatchling was watching him through half-closed eyes. Ash, though Walt did not yet know his name, was trying to understand what was happening. He had eaten twice now because of this human. He was warmer than he had been in 3 days because of this human. The human had not grabbed him, had not hurt him, had not even raised his voice. In every story the older dragons told, humans were dangerous. Humans were something to avoid or to fight. But this human was just sitting against the wall in a damp coat, keeping a torch alive so the cave stayed warm, and looking at nothing in particular with a calm and tired face. Ash did not understand it. He was too tired and too warm now to keep thinking about it. His eyes closed fully. Walt kept the torch alive all night. In the morning the storm was gone. The storm was gone by the time Walt opened his eyes. Gray morning light came in through the cave entrance, pale and quiet. The rain had stopped. The wind had settled down to almost nothing. Outside, the hillside was wet and still, and the air smelled clean the way it always did after a hard storm. Walt sat up slowly and rolled his neck. Sleeping against the cave wall had not been kind to his back. He pressed his knuckles into the stone floor and pushed himself to his feet, wincing. Then he looked across the cave. Ash was awake. The hatchling was sitting up under the cloak, watching Walt with calm dark eyes. He looked better than he had the night before. The deep exhausted blankness was gone from his face. He was alert, present. Still small, still pale, but alive in a way that he had not quite looked the night before. Walt nodded at him. Good morning, more or less. Ash did not nod back. But he did not press against the wall either. Walt crouched down to pack up his things. He rolled the extra cloth he had used as a pillow and pushed it into his bag. He checked his water skin. He counted what food he had left, not much but enough for the walk home if he moved steadily. He was about to stand up when he noticed it. The cloak had slipped off Ash's left side during the night, and in the flat morning light Walt could see the wing clearly for the first time. He went still. The right wing was folded neatly against Ash's side, small but properly shaped, the membrane smooth, the bone running clean from joint to tip. It looked like a wing was supposed to look. The left wing was different. It sat wrong against his body, angled too far out, the leading edge bent sharply where it should have been straight. The membrane on the lower half was thin and uneven, almost transparent in places. Walt was not an expert on dragon anatomy. He had never studied it and had no reason to. But he had fixed enough broken things in his life, fence posts, cartwheels, a goat's leg once, to know when something had not grown the way it was meant to. That wing would never work. Walt sat back on his heels and looked at Ash for a long moment. Ash looked back at him. There was something in the hatchling's eyes that was hard to name. Not shame exactly. More like the steady quiet look of a creature that already knew something was wrong with itself and had decided to simply carry that knowledge without making noise about it. Walt thought about the cave. About being alone in it for who knew how long. About the dull scales and the hunger and the deep bone-cold shivering. He thought about the mother who had not come back. He picked up his pack and stood up. Then he looked at Ash and jerked his head toward the cave entrance. Ash tilted his head. Walt jerked his head again. Come on. Ash did not move for a moment. He looked at the entrance. He looked at Walt. He looked at the entrance again. Then, slowly and with some effort, he got to his feet. His legs were steadier than they had been last night. He took a few careful steps toward Walt, stopped and looked up at him. Walt turned and walked out of the cave. After a short pause, Ash followed. Outside, the morning was cold and bright. Water dripped from the trees. The path down the hill was muddy and cut through with small streams from the night's rain. Walt walked carefully and looked back every few steps to check that Ash was still behind him. Ash was. He picked his way down the hill slowly, his bad wing held a little away from his body for balance, his eyes moving across everything. The trees, the sky, the open space around him, with careful attention. It took most of the morning to reach the farmstead. It was a small place. A stone cottage with a low roof. A vegetable patch along the south wall. A pen with 3 goats who immediately went to the far side of their pen when they saw Ash and pressed together in a tight, unhappy group. A woodpile under a leaning shelter. A water barrel by the door. Walt pushed the door open and set his pack inside. Before he could do anything else, he heard footsteps on the path behind him. It was the village elder, a broad old man named Stan, who had apparently seen Walt coming down the hill from his house on the edge of the village. Stan stopped at the gate and looked at Ash standing in Walt's yard with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things go wrong in his life and was watching one more thing begin. Walt, he said. What is that? A hatchling, Walt said. I can see that, Stan said. What is it doing in your yard? Walt thought about how to answer that. He could not entirely explain it himself. I found him in the cave on the North Hill, he said. Storm last night. He was alone. Stan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, slowly and clearly, the way people speak when they want to make sure they are understood, Walt, that is a dragon. You cannot keep a dragon. Walt nodded. Stan continued. It will grow. It will eat your goats. It will burn your roof. Its kind will come looking for it. This will end badly. Walt nodded again. He listened to all of it. He let Stan finish completely. Then he looked down at Ash, who was standing very still in the yard, looking at nothing, pretending he could not feel Stan's eyes on him. Walt picked up his pack from inside the door. He held it open. Ash walked inside. Walt closed the door. The first week was the hardest. Ash did not know what to do with walls. He had spent his short life in an open cave and before that in the clutch, and the low ceiling of Walt's cottage made him press flat to the floor the first night, eyes on every corner, ready for something to happen. Nothing happened. Walt lit the fire in the hearth, put a blanket down near it and pointed at it. Ash slept there. By the third night he was no longer watching the ceiling. Walt had a routine and he kept to it without fuss. He was up before the sun. He fed the goats, checked the vegetable patch, chopped wood, carried water. He did all of it quietly and steadily, the way a man does when he has lived alone for a long time and has stopped expecting anyone to notice. But now someone was noticing. Ash followed him everywhere. Not closely at first. He kept a few steps back, watching from a distance, the way a cautious animal learns a new place. But Walt never shooed him away. Never told him to stay inside or stay out of the way. He just went about his work and talked as he went, the same way some people talk to themselves when they think no one is listening. That fence post needs to go back in before the ground freezes, Walt would say, pushing the post with his boot. Otherwise the goats get out and then I spend half the morning chasing them around the hill, which I have done twice already this year and I am not doing it a third time. Ash would look at the fence post, then at the goats, then back at Walt. Walt would pick up the post and start digging. It went on like that. Walt talking, Ash listening. Simple words, plain sentences. The names of things. What they were for. Why they mattered. Walt did not use a special voice for it, the slow, loud voice people sometimes used with animals or children. He spoke the same way he always spoke, calm, even a little dry. Ash started to pick things up. Not all at once. It was slow, like water working into dry ground. A word here, a word there, connecting to an action he had seen repeated. Water. Fire. Cold. Morning. The goats had names. Walt called them by their names every single day without fail, which Ash found both strange and interesting. Weeks passed. Ash grew. Not dramatically, not the way a healthy hatchling in a proper clutch would grow. But steadily. His scales took on a little more color, deeper and darker than the dull pale they had been in the cave. He filled out through the chest and neck. His legs got stronger. His left wing stayed the same. Walt never mentioned it. He never looked at it with pity and he never looked at it with discomfort. When Ash accidentally knocked a water bucket over with it one afternoon, Walt just picked the bucket up and refilled it without comment, the same as he would have done if he had knocked it over himself. Ash noticed that. He noticed it very clearly. One evening Walt sat by the fire after supper and told a long story about a flood that had hit the valley when he was a boy, how the whole village had moved to higher ground for 2 weeks and how his father had carried their oldest goat on his back the entire way because the goat refused to walk in the mud. Ash sat across the fire and listened to the whole thing. At the end Walt looked at him and said, "I don't know if any of that makes sense to you." Ash looked back at him steadily. Walt nodded slowly. Right then. The trouble came on a morning in the 5th week. Ash was in the yard. Walt was at the far end of the vegetable patch, pulling up the last of the autumn roots before the ground turned hard. The sky was wide and pale blue and very clear. The shadow came without warning. It passed over the yard like a storm cloud moving fast, except the sky was empty. Ash looked up. His body went tight before his mind caught up with what he was seeing. An adult dragon was circling overhead. Large, dark-scaled, moving in a slow descending spiral, the way a hunting bird moves when it has already decided on something. It landed on the hill just above the yard with a sound that shook the ground, and it folded its wings and looked down at Ash with eyes like pale fire. It was a scout. Ash knew the type without needing to be told. Lean and hard-looking, built for distance flying, for watching and reporting. This one had been watching for some time, he guessed. The scout looked at Ash the way you look at something disappointing. It spoke in the old tongue, low and sharp. Living with a human. Eating from a human's hand. Sleeping under a human roof. It let the words sit for a moment. Then it said, "You are a disgrace to your kind, small one." Ash felt the words land. He had spent 5 weeks not thinking about what he was. About what he was not. About what the clutch had decided he was worth. He felt all of it move through him. Then he stood up straight. His bad wings sat crooked at his side. His scales were still not the deep, proud color of a proper dragon. He was still small. He did not move back. He looked up at the scout and held his ground in the yard of the small farmstead, in front of the cottage with the low roof and the goat pen and the vegetable patch, and he did not look away. Behind him he heard Walt's boots on the path. Walt had come back from the vegetable patch. He stood beside Ash, close, not in front of him. He did not try to protect him. He just stood there the way he always did, calm, even a little dry. Ash kept his eyes on the scout. The scout looked at them both. The scout did not leave. He sat on the hill above the yard and looked down at them with those pale fire eyes, and the longer he sat the heavier the silence got. The kind of silence that had weight to it. The kind that came before something happened. Then he spoke again. He was not speaking to Ash this time. He lowered his head toward Walt and let a slow curl of smoke rise from his nostrils. His voice dropped to something quieter and more deliberate, which was somehow worse than if he had been loud. He said that humans who kept dragons did not tend to fare well. That it was not natural. That things which were not natural had a way of being corrected. It was not quite a threat. It was said too calmly for that. But it was not anything else either. Walt looked at the smoke rising from the scout's nostrils. He looked at the size of him, the broad dark chest, the wings still half spread, the claws pressed into the hillside that had left deep marks in the wet earth. Walt was a small man with a worn coat and muddy boots and no weapon of any kind. He did not step back. Ash felt it before he decided it. Something moved up through his chest, fast and hot, and then he was moving, stepping forward and placing himself directly between Walt and the scout. His bad wings spread out to the side at its wrong angle, the only way it knew how to go. His legs were shaking. He could feel them shaking and he could not make them stop. But he did not move back. He looked up at the scout and stayed where he was. The scout stared down at him. For a moment something shifted in those pale eyes, not softness exactly but something close to confusion. He had not expected this. A small malformed hatchling with a crooked wing, putting himself between a human and a full-grown scout, shaking like a leaf and not moving an inch. It did not make sense by any measure, the scout knew. Then Walt stepped forward too. He came up beside Ash, close, and he looked up at the scout with the same expression he used for everything. The fence post that needed fixing, the goats that got out, the roof that needed attention. Come. Even. Unhurried. He said, his name is Ash. He lives here. He is staying. That was all. No long speech. No argument. No list of reasons. Just that. The scout shifted his weight on the hillside. His eyes moved between Walt and Ash. Between the small shaking hatchling and the small quiet farmer standing side by side in the yard of a farmstead that was, by any dragon standard, entirely unremarkable. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He looked at Ash one more time. At the crooked wing. At the legs that were still trembling but had not moved. At the eyes that were looking straight up at him without flinching. Something passed across the scout's face that had no clean name. He pulled his wings in. He turned on the hillside. And without another word he launched himself upward, the downbeat of his wings sending a rush of cold air across the yard that flattened the grass and rattled the cottage door. Then he was gone. The sky was empty and pale blue and very quiet. Ash stood in the yard for a long moment. His legs were still shaking. His heart was going very fast. He stared at the place in the sky where the scout had been and waited for the feeling in his chest to settle. Walt put his hand on Ash's neck. Just rested it there lightly, the way he sometimes did with the goats when they were unsettled. Good lad, he said quietly. That was all. They went inside. Walt made a fire in the hearth and put water on to heat and went about the evening the same as any other evening. He did not talk about what had happened. He did not make it into a story or a lesson or a moment to be examined. He just moved around the cottage doing the small quiet things that needed doing, and the fire grew and the room got warm. Ash lay by the hearth and watched him. He thought about the scout's words. Disgrace. Not natural. Things that are not natural get corrected. He had heard words like that before in a different form on a different day. He had heard them in the silence of the mother who turned away. In the push of the clutch that did not want him. In 3 days alone in a cold cave waiting for something that was not coming. He had heard all of that. And then he had heard something else. His name is Ash. He lives here. He is staying. He turned that over slowly. The simplicity of it. Walt had not said it like a declaration or a challenge. He had said it the way he said everything, like it was just a fact, like it was just true, like there was nothing complicated about it at all. Ash looked at the fire. He had spent a long time hoping for the wrong things. Hoping the mother would come back. Hoping his wing would straighten itself out one morning. Hoping he would become something the clutch would have wanted. None of that was coming. But this was here. This small cottage. These thin walls. The goats outside who had mostly gotten used to him by now. The routine of mornings and firewood and water and Walt's voice moving through the day like something steady and reliable. This was already here. Ash put his head down on his front legs and let his eyes close. The fire was warm against his scales. The room was quiet. Outside, the night was cold and clear, and somewhere far above the hills the stars were out. He did not hope for flying. He did not hope for the clutch. He just lay beside the fire in the place that was his, next to the human who had said so, and for the first time in his short and difficult life, he felt something settle in his chest that had no name but did not need one. It was enough. It was more than enough.